Hi guys, Olive here today to do the next installment in my ongoing series of videos all about the 90s PBS Kids TV show, Wishbone. This was a show that told 2 stories per episode. One storyline was the real-life storyline that focused on a family living in Texas with their pet Jack Russell Terrier Wishbone, and the other storyline was always an adaptation of a classic work of literature that was either related or semi-related to the real-life storyline. In this series of videos I do here on this channel, I look at one episode of Wishbone per video and I compare it against the classic work of literature, or if it's a play or whatever they chose to take on in that episode. I look at what they chose to include from the famous work versus what they may have left out and why they may have left it out. I judge whether or not they made the material from the classic work understandable. In particular, I look to see whether or not there are any moral messages being transferred over from the classic work that they're choosing to highlight for their young audience. And then finally, I judge whether or not it made for an entertaining episode of television. In today's video, we will be looking at the ancient classic Homer's Odyssey that is taken on in an episode entitled Home, Sweet Homer. I bet it will be a trip. Let's take a look. What's the story, Wishbone?
What's the story, Wishbone? What's this you're dreaming of?
The start of this episode is very similar to the start of the book because in both cases, our main character is being held hostage. In Wishbone's case, David's younger sister Emily has him locked up in a cage when she takes him to a big tree in the park and tells him that they're going to be living there now. Of course, this is the perfect segue into the beginning of the Odyssey, which isn't actually told chronologically. The book begins when Odysseus, played by Wishbone of course, is trapped on Calypso's island. He desperately wants to get home to his wife Penelope, who has been waiting 20 long years for her husband's return. His son Telemachus has also been waiting for his father's return and is running out of patience with the freeloading men who've taken over his house in his father's absence. Meanwhile, back in the real-life storyline, Wishbone's owner Joe and his friends Sam and David catch up with David's little sister Emily, who still has possession of Wishbone. They are able to set the dog free, but they're not hanging in the park for very long before some very intimidating-looking developers show up, saying that they have permission to clear that area of the park, including a historic tree, to make room for a new shopping complex. The whole cast of characters, including the family's eccentric neighbor Wanda, who happens to be my favorite character of the entire series, they come up with a plan to stop this from happening. But unfortunately, they'll have to move quickly because the bulldozers have already arrived. They're up against a tough enemy, just like Odysseus back in the adaptation, because once Calypso finally comes to her senses, realizes how unhappy Odysseus has been living with her, realizes how desperately he wants to get home to his family, she finally decides to let him go, but not before warning him that it will be a tough journey back home. And boy, is it ever, when the god of the sea Poseidon decides to interfere by kicking up a storm, making Odysseus swim back to the shores of Ithaca. Back in Texas, Wanda storms up to the developer in that suit, tells him just what a weasel he is, and serves him with a restraining order, meaning that he has to stay off of the property and away from that tree until the matter can be brought up in front of City Council. You go, Wanda. And speaking of chasing away villains, the story of the Odyssey in this adaptation section is once again fast-forwarded to the point where Odysseus approaches his son Telemachus, letting him know who he is and that he and his mother Penelope have hatched a plan to chase those nasty suitors out of the house for good. They're going to stage a stunt that only Odysseus can achieve, which is to shoot an arrow through the handles of 12 battle axes. Penelope goes before the freeloading jerks, poses this challenge, and vows to marry the man who can achieve it. Odysseus, in disguise, takes on the challenge, much to the ridicule of the other men, breezes through it, and then chases all of the bros away. The kids in Texas are getting ready to speak in front of the city council. They're hoping to plead their case so that this section of the park, and that tree in particular, will be able to be spared this development in progress. All 3 of them, one at a time, get up in front of everyone and tell their story of what the park and that tree specifically has meant to them. It's really moving and relates back to the final section of the adaptation. The story of the Odyssey may have ended by this point in the episode, but the kids giving their orations leads Wishbone to tell the audience how the Odyssey wasn't actually a book first, but a story told verbally. They show a figure meant to be Homer. You can't see his face, but you can hear him speaking ancient Greek. And that, my friends, is basically the whole episode. Now, you may be thinking, what the what now? Where's the rest of the story? Where's Zeus and Athena? Where's Polyphemus? Where's Circe? And the answer to those questions is they're in the video game. Yes, in case you didn't know, there was indeed a computer game called Wishbone and the Amazing Odyssey, in which you take control of Wishbone as Odysseus as he attempts to escape from Polyphemus's cave and from Circe's island and from the wrath of Scylla. It's a chronological look at Odysseus's Odyssey, and it does end with his return to Ithaca. Now, of course, I could and probably should criticize this episode for not including those elements that absolutely belong in any kind of adaptation of the Odyssey, and instead relying upon the fact that their audience would go back and play this video game in order to get the complete picture of the Odyssey. But I honestly wasn't that mad at it. I have since gone back and watched through some playthroughs of the video game, and I really like how everything came together as a whole. Surprisingly enough, I actually liked most things about this episode, beginning with the very quick intro of Wishbone being locked in the cage and the comparison to Odysseus being trapped on Calypso's island, then both the kids and Odysseus fighting against forces of nature and enemies in order to achieve their goals, and then concluding with a message about the power of oral storytelling. I also want to make a point to note that the acting that the three kids do, specifically when they're delivering their speeches, is so good in this episode. They make the emotion incredibly believable. Episodes of Wishbone normally do include a little bit about the author, maybe the year the work was written, things along those lines. But this episode took things a little bit further. I thought the inclusion of an actor to play Homer was a really nice touch, and the fact that you could hear him speaking his native tongue was great. You even get to hear Wishbone speaking a little bit of ancient Greek. When I read this back in high school, the tradition of oral storytelling was a really big part of the learning experience of learning about the Odyssey. So seeing Homer, an actor playing Homer, walking around a fire, telling the story of the Odyssey, actually hearing him do that, it really painted the picture. The writers of this episode do allude, right at the very end, that there's a little bit more to this story than what you may have seen in this episode. Wishbone as Odysseus does mention Polyphemus offhandedly. I am sure that they're hoping that you will feel tempted to go and play the video game to see the full story, which isn't great for modern audiences who probably don't have a machine that can run a Windows 95 game. However, as I mentioned before, there are playthroughs of this video game that you can watch here on YouTube. I will put a link up in the cards and down in the description box below to the one I watched, in case you're looking for yet another nostalgia hit. At the end of the day, I do think this was a really good episode of Wishbone. I'm kind of surprised that I feel that way because it is so incomplete, but it almost feels like those omissions were intentional to make the two storylines more harmonious, which they definitely were in this episode, and that's not something I can say about every episode of Wishbone. I'm doing my best not to be biased in this installment of What's the Story Wishbone, because this is the Wishbone episode that I remember best from my childhood. I remember we watched this maybe in elementary or middle school, and then when I got to high school and we read through the Odyssey, I remember getting to the end of the Odyssey and being like, oh, this, I remember this. And now as an adult, after having rewatched this episode and after having reread the book this month, I can see why it took me until the end of the book to recognize that these are the same story, because so many elements of the Odyssey were omitted from this episode. And I still can't believe I'm not more upset about that, but I stand by my opinion. It's a good episode. So that's it for this installment of What's the Story Wishbone. If you have any comments or questions about anything you've seen in this video or about anything in general, you can feel free to put it in the comment section below. Or if you would like to connect with me somewhere other than YouTube, I am on a variety of different places on social media, and the links to all of my profiles will be in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.
Funding for Wishbone provided by annual financial support from PBS viewers like you.